So after covering some of the measures and metrics that we want to look at in our overall performance measurement, we want to start having an idea of what could go on in the future. And this is where the idea of sales and demand forecasting comes in. And part of the reason for this, there's a variety of reasons why we need to forecast or why we look at things, but one of the components here is that revenue is not necessarily consistent, particularly in small and medium-sized businesses. In large companies with consistent buyers or customers, the revenue might be more consistent, yet they probably have more resources than they do the forecasting anyways. But in smaller and medium-sized companies, forecasting is probably necessary in order to get a sense of what might be coming down the road. In addition to that, if you're trying to grow your business or expand your market, forecasting will also be necessary, as it'll start to give you a sense of what do you need to add to your business. So decision making is going to require some level of forecasting involved. You know, when are you going to hire staff? If your forecasting says that you're not going to see a revenue increase in 6 months, why would you be hiring staff now? There might be other reasons for it, but you know those are the types of decisions that you'll be making and require some level of forecasting for. Customer satisfaction is a major component as to why we're going to forecast and how responsive you are. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but how responsive you are, and is that part of your core business, is being responsive to your customers? Well, by doing a better job of forecasting and by doing some level of forecasting, you might be able to respond to your customers better and increase the satisfaction with that. Further, and probably one of the bigger reasons why we want to look at forecasting, is the idea of resource allocation. If we know that we're growing, and if you're growing in different areas, geographic areas or so forth, you may want to consider investing in additional facilities or equipment. You want to expand your capacity. This is also another area when we're looking at resource allocation and expanding capacity that we may want to consider looking at automation as a way of helping us expand our capacity. But again, all of this relies on forecasting. If we're staying exactly where we are today, do we need to be doing any of this? So we talked about the need or the necessity for forecasting. Let's talk about kind of the time horizons as it relates to forecasting. Long-term forecasting is good for looking at larger decisions. If we're talking about building new facilities, buying equipment with significant lead time, even some make or buy decisions for our parts may be long-term kinds of things, depending on the equipment involved and the lead time for that equipment. So there's longer-term forecasting, there's a need for longer-term forecasting, and it relates to overall long-term kind of assets to build that capacity. Typically, we're talking 36 months plus for these kinds of decisions. Medium-term kind of capacity may look at staff levels. We might be looking at hiring decisions based on medium term. There may be some level of inventory considerations, supplier selection. There may be some level of make or buy decisions in the medium term as well. And again, this comes down to what do we expect in that medium term? What do we have to get in place in order to satisfy our customers in that medium term, and so forth. And automation projects within the supply chain will probably affect long-term, medium-term, and short-term, and it all depends on the particular project that you're looking at. Medium-term forecasts would probably be looking at that 18 months to 36-month area. Again, it's going to be relative to your business. Governments are going to extend these kinds of time horizons, and small businesses may retract these kinds of time horizons to quicker periods. Finally, in the short term, you'll talk about things like job scheduling, inventory levels, and so forth. And typically we're under 18 months in the short term. So what are some of the implications within forecasting? Well, the longer out we go, the harder it is to guess. That makes a lot of sense. You know, when we're further out, it's going to be harder to predict that future. Further, the more detailed we get, so if we drive down into more functional areas, or we have 7 branches and we try to get detailed out forecasts for those branches, the more detail we get, the more inaccurate we'll be in our forecasting. But as we aggregate those forecasts, those typically get more accurate. So, what does this all mean in terms of practical solutions? Typically, what I look at doing within forecasting is I figure out what period of time makes sense, what periods do I want to forecast. If I'm in a very much a retail business, I may look at doing weekly or daily forecasting for a period of time. If I'm looking at weekly forecasting, I'll typically forecast for 13 weeks. I'll then move to a monthly kind of a forecast for up to 18 months. And then I'll typically go to an annual forecast or a quarterly forecast for the next 3 to 5 years from there. So at the end of the day, you kind of want to pick what kind of forecasting makes sense for your business, and you're probably going to go into different levels of detail based in part on where you're at with some of that forecasting and what you're trying to achieve, where your focus is. If your focus is in short, medium term, you're going to do things a little differently than if your focus is in a 20-year plan of building warehouse facilities or those types of things. So first we'd look at internal data, and unfortunately this is where a lot of companies kind of end their forecasting, if they've done anything at all, is that they'll look at their historical data and they'll apply some sort of arbitrary percentage to that. We think we're going to grow by 5%, and across the board we'll go 5%, and that'll be our level of forecasting. I'd encourage you to go beyond that and look a little bit more as to your internal data and even your own notes and sales notes within your sales force and so forth. But I'd also encourage you to look at external data and look at other things that are going on. What are some of the headwinds going on in the economics? What's going on politically, technologically, socially, environmentally, and legally? What's all going on and how that's going to change? We talked about doing the pestle assessment or external environment scanning with risks and threats in project management, but now you should also look at that when you're looking at external data. And that can be external predictive data, it can be external data that is known as well. So within that, keep that in mind as you're looking at external data. With that in mind, let's talk a little bit about forecasting methods. So there's some basic straight line methods. As I said, if you've seen growth over the last 3 years of roughly 3% each year, you could apply 3% growth, and that's kind of a type of trending. You can look at moving averages or weighting moving averages as well, which relies on the last certain number of periods of time. And if you're seeing a nonlinear growth rate, something like a moving average would probably help you cover that, or weighted moving average if you want to put more weight to the most recent period. Those are options for your forecasting as well. The challenge with some of those options are that you can't forecast that terribly far in advance. They rely on historical data, so you might be able to only forecast the next period. That said, you can look at some form of linear regression or a simple regression analysis as a way of forecasting. And this, you're taking one variable and you're forecasting another variable with it, typically based on time with simple or linear regression. The benefit here is that you can forecast further into the future. Now, when you're talking about considering additional data into your forecasting, you may want to consider something like a multiple regression forecast or a multiple regression analysis, where you effectively create a formula that helps you predict what the forecast will be going forward. And this is something where I've personally used weather data, precipitation levels, GDPs, exchange rates, commodity prices, and I've put that into data, or put that into a formula with historical data for companies, and then use that to create a formula to then use to do my forecasting in the future. And that's something that's ends up being quite a powerful way of forecasting and gives me some level of comfort in the forecasting. That said, there's no perfect solution to forecasting. You're just trying to come up with a best guess for the forecast. So one of the things that you need to do within this forecasting is do a bit of a cost-benefit analysis. How much is going to change based on the accuracy of your forecast? And if that's significant, if you're going to alter significant amounts of inventory levels and you're going to have a lot of capital tied up in those inventory because of your changes in forecasting, you're probably going to spend more time and effort into the forecasting. If, however, it's not going to make much of a difference in your business, then you might want to spend a little less time. That all said, multiple regression analysis and these types of things are becoming fairly easy to do. I would consider strongly looking at doing some level of forecasting in these kinds of ways, as you'll probably find that it gives you some insights as to what factors might affect your business, and even that information might be quite valuable to you. Okay, so you have the basic forecast laid out, whether you used some sort of trending or whether you looked at multiple regression. However you ended up doing your forecasting, you have that figured out. There's adjustments to forecasts that are going to come up. A lot of businesses are seasonal in nature. Retail, for example, is a very seasonal business. Oil and gas is also a seasonal business in Canada, for example. So depending on your forecasting, you may want to look at seasonality factors in your forecasting. If you're forecasting on a monthly basis, you'll probably apply seasonality multipliers to a monthly basis. If you're forecasting quarterly, maybe it's quarterly seasonality factors, and so forth. What you look at doing with this is you take your initial data, you deseasonalize it by figuring out whatever the average multipliers are for that particular month or quarter versus the average overall. So you deseasonalize the data, you apply your forecasting techniques, you then turn around and you use those multipliers you figured out to deseasonalize the data, and you now seasonalize the forecasted data. So seasonality is important, particularly when you're talking about inventory levels and so forth. So it's something that you probably want to adjust your forecast for. In addition to seasonality, business has a dynamic nature. It's inherently dynamic. So there's going to be continuous changes that need to be made. You're going to continuously update things. I've personally found by doing forecasting and working with my forecasts and updating actual information into the forecasts, I've actually become quite a bit wiser on businesses that I've had in the past and what types of things are influencing the demand and the sales overall. There's also structural change in environment or in the industry overall. We've seen this since cannabis has been legalized. That was a structural change that has affected all sorts of businesses, directly and indirectly related. So there's all sorts of things going into consideration as it relates to the forecasts, and it's important to always be doing those environmental scans to try to get a handle on what could be changing down the road, and then to update your forecast as need be. There's no sense doing a forecast and saying, well, the forecast is done for the next 5 years, so I'm not going to do it for another 5 years. That'd be absolutely insane, and you'd be disrespecting the very nature of our business environment. So take that information, take those structural changes and so forth, and revisit those forecasts, and revisit them on a regular basis. Probably revisit them when you're revisiting your financial reports. And I'm hoping that you probably look at those on a regular basis as well. As I said before though, the knowledge that you gain from forecasting is absolutely valuable knowledge. And not just you as a business owner or as a manager in the business, but by going through and doing the forecasting exercise and bringing in functional managers and some of your staff into that exercise, you're going to find that they become much more versed in the business, much more versed in the drivers of your business, and quite aware of what's going on. And they'll be some of your best detectives when it relates to what's changing and what's going on in the external environment.